Welcome to another quiet evening of history. Tonight, we take a slow, steady journey into one of the most whispered about events of the 20th century. A story that has echoed softly through late-night radio shows, faded newspaper clippings, and the curious corners of conspiracy books. But here, we will tell it gently, not with excitement, not with fear, but with calm reflection. This is the story of the Roswell Incident. But tonight, it isn't a mystery to be solved. It's a quiet chapter in the dusty archives of history, retold softly, so you can relax and fall asleep. Wherever you are, whether in your bed with the lights dimmed low, or resting on a couch under a cozy blanket, let yourself slow down. You don't need to stay alert. You don't need to concentrate. Just let the rhythm of the words carry you, okay? Maybe you're lying down. Maybe your eyes are already heavy, okay? Maybe you're listening because sleep hasn't come yet, cool? Or maybe you're someone who just enjoys stories that ask very little of you. Either way, you're in the right place. What time is it where you are right now? Is it late evening with the world winding down? Or is it past midnight when the silence stretches out long and soft? Wherever the clock hands fall, you're not in a rush. There's nowhere else you need to be. This story will unfold slowly at the pace of the desert wind. Take a deep breath, let it out gently. And now, imagine yourself in the warmth of a high desert evening, in a town where the streets are quiet, where the stars shine brightly overhead, and the horizon stretches further than the eye can follow. The year is 1947. You're in southeastern New Mexico, in a place called Roswell. At this time in history, the world is still settling from the tremors of the Second World War. The Cold War is only beginning to cast its long shadow. Television is still a luxury, and most people gather around radios in the evening or sit on porch steps, fanning themselves with folded newspapers. The air is dry. The crickets sing softly, and far beyond the edge of town, out in the open fields and the ranchlands, something unusual is about to be found. But for now, there's no alarm, no headlines. It's just the slow ticking of a clock, the creak of a screen door, and the hush of the desert wind moving through the sagebrush. Tonight, we won't be solving a mystery. We won't be asking what's true or false. We'll simply be listening to the story, quietly and without urgency. So, settle in. You don't have to follow every word. You can let your mind drift if it wants to. We'll still be here, moving gently through time. Now, if you're ready, let's return to a summer day in July. When the sky above Roswell was cloudless, something strange had just landed in the middle of nowhere. The town of Roswell in 1947 was not the center of extraterrestrial speculation that it would later become. Instead, it was a modest, sun-baked community in southeastern New Mexico. It's quiet and unassuming, where life moved at a gentle pace. Around 25,000 people lived there at the time, many of them working in agriculture, ranching, for the nearby military base that loomed just outside the city limits. Roswell streets were wide, lined with brick buildings and dusty storefronts. In the mornings, the light came softly through thin curtains, and the sound of roosters or a neighbor's car engine starting served as the day's first announcements. A soft breeze might lift the edge of a newspaper on a porch as a dog stretched in the sun. Coffee was poured without haste. Radios clicked on with a brief hum, and the quiet drone of the local AM station filled kitchens and living rooms. Main Street served as the town's pulse. There were general stores and diners, hardware shops and barbers, small pharmacies with handwritten signs taped to the window. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks, and the smell of warm asphalt mingled with the scent of cut hay from nearby farms. People greeted each other by name. The sense of routine, of calm repetition, was part of Roswell's charm. The sky above was often clear, painted in wide gradients of blue that gave way to dusty reds and golds at dusk. The sun could be relentless, but the dry air made it bearable. Evenings brought relief, and with them a kind of quiet stillness. The desert was a place that encouraged listening to the wind, to the animals, to the silence itself. Just outside of town sat the Roswell Army Airfield, an installation of growing importance in the years following World War II. It was home to the 509th Bomb Group, the very same unit that had dropped the atomic bombs over Japan in 1945. The presence of such a unit gave the base a certain gravity, but its activities were largely kept from public view. Most locals knew only what they saw: planes flying overhead, uniformed men shopping in town, and the occasional convoy passing by on the highway. The relationship between Roswell's residents and the airfield was one of coexistence, not curiosity. The military did what it needed to do, and the townsfolk focused on their own routines: baking bread, raising livestock, attending church, and watching the world change slowly from the corner of a general store. Beyond the town and the base lay the vast openness of the New Mexico countryside. Long stretches of flat land extended to the horizon, broken only by low hills, fence lines, and the occasional lone structure. There were ranches scattered throughout this wide expanse, humble, practical operations with cattle, sheep, or both. Among them was the Foster Ranch, operated by a man named William Mac Brazel. Mac Brazel was not a man concerned with mysteries. He was a rancher through and through, known for being steady, independent, and hardworking. Like many in the area, he spent long hours outdoors, tending to animals, fixing fences, and riding across land that seemed to go on forever. The days were repetitive in many ways, but there was comfort in the cycle. You rose with the sun, worked with your hands, and rested when the sky grew dark again. The desert could be harsh, but to those who knew it, it was also beautiful. The smell of sagebrush after a rare rain, the way the wind whispered through mesquite trees, the crunch of dry soil underfoot, it all became part of daily life. Coyotes howled in the distance at night, and sometimes strange lights flickered over the horizon, usually dismissed as planes, stars, or the occasional lightning storm over distant hills. July of 1947 brought little to mark it as unusual at first. The heat was typical for the season, and the town continued its quiet rhythm. There were picnics and church socials, baseball games, and family dinners. Radios carried updates from Washington, D.C., and ads for cigarettes or cleaning products filled the airwaves between soft orchestral music. Life felt predictable. But on the morning after Independence Day, out on the open land of the Foster Ranch, Mac Brazel noticed something different. Something that didn't belong among the yucca plants and fence posts. Pieces of material scattered across a remote pasture, strange in shape and texture, glittering slightly in the morning sun. Still, for now, that story remains untouched, because in order to understand what was found, we must first understand what was normal. And normal in Roswell in July of 1947 was quiet, slow, and familiar. It was coffee in a tin mug, cattle in the distance, and stars overhead, so clear they seemed within reach. It was a town with one foot in the past and another just beginning to step into the unknown. A place where few things changed, until, very suddenly, something did. Out on the open land of the Foster Ranch, about 75 miles northwest of Roswell, the morning of July 5th, 1947, began much like any other for Mac Brazel, who had spent the previous night indoors, sheltering from a summer storm that had swept across the high plains with a kind of dry, lightning, and rattling winds that were not uncommon in that part of the country. As the sun lifted gently over the land, bringing with it the golden warmth of another desert morning, Mac saddled his horse and began his routine patrol of the property, checking on the fencing, the water troughs, and the sheep that grazed across the wide open pastures. It was during this quiet ride, somewhere near a stretch of grazing land he rarely paid much attention to, that he noticed something scattered along the dry earth. Pieces of material unlike anything he had seen before, glinting softly in the light, resting among the dirt and tufts of desert grass like a puzzle broken into dozens of strange, silent pieces. The debris field stretched far, more than what you might expect from a simple weather balloon or a fallen advertisement banner. Hey, and as he dismounted and bent down to examine it, he found strips of what seemed to be a type of foil, but it wasn't like ordinary foil. No, this material was light but firm. It would crumple and then return to its original shape, smooth and silent, as if it had memory, as if it resisted destruction. There were beams too, thin and oddly strong, some with markings that looked almost like symbols, not quite letters, not quite numbers, stamped or printed into their surface in patterns Mac could not decipher. And though he had lived a quiet life and claimed no great knowledge of science or technology, he knew enough to say this was not something he had seen fall from the sky before. Confused but not yet alarmed, Mac gathered a small collection of the debris and rode back toward town, stopping first at a neighbor's place, then eventually making his way into Roswell, where the local sheriff, George Wilcox, listened carefully to his account and examined the unusual material for himself, fingering the metallic strips with quiet suspicion before deciding that this was perhaps a matter for the military, not the sheriff's office. By July 7th, the sheriff had contacted the Roswell Army Airfield, and Major Jesse Marcel, the base intelligence officer, was sent to investigate a man known for his discipline and quiet manner, trusted with sensitive information, someone who would later become a key figure in the story's slow unspooling. Marcel drove out with Brazel, examined the site, and brought back samples of the material to the base, storing it in brown paper wrapping in metal containers. Still unaware of the shadow the incident would cast over his career and reputation in the decades to come. Then, on July 8th, something remarkable happened. Something simple on the surface, but unusual in the history of government response. The base issued a press release publicly announcing that the military had recovered a flying disc from a ranch near Roswell, and the story was quickly picked up by the Roswell Daily Record. Its afternoon edition ran a headline that would later become iconic. RAF captures flying saucer on a ranch in Roswell region. The news traveled fast, like dust on the desert wind, and for a brief moment, the world turned its attention to this small, unassuming town. This quiet corner of New Mexico that had suddenly become the center of something mysterious and unexplained. But the excitement didn't last long, because by the very next day, July 9th, the narrative had shifted. Military officials now stated that the object was not a flying disc at all, but a weather balloon, a misidentified piece of standard equipment used for monitoring atmospheric conditions. And a second press conference was held, where Jesse Marcel posed alongside the wreckage. This time, holding what appeared to be tattered rubber and wooden sticks, the kind of mundane items that would not stir the imagination. This reversal quieted the public interest, at least for a while, as the idea of extraterrestrial contact was politely shelved in favor of a far more reasonable explanation, one that required no questions and inspired little debate. But even at the time, not everyone believed the official story, and whispers began to circulate among locals, among servicemen, and later among researchers who would dig into the inconsistencies, to the contradictions between what was first reported and what was later claimed. Why, they asked, would the most elite bomb group in the world, the very unit entrusted with nuclear weapons, be unable to identify a weather balloon? Something common and familiar, something that should have posed no confusion. Why had officers spoken so directly about a flying disc, only to change course within a single day? And what about the debris itself, the strange, self-healing foil, the symbols, the material that did not seem to burn, tear, or behave like anything publicly known at the time for decades? These questions would drift in and out of public memory, resurfacing in books, in interviews, in late-night broadcasts, in whispered conversations. Never fully answered, never fully disproven. But in that moment, in the middle of July 1947, the cover story was in place, the files were closed, and the incident was quietly folded into the rhythms of official history. Mac Brazel, for his part, disappeared briefly from the public eye, turning to his ranch and later giving carefully worded statements, likely under the quiet influence of military persuasion. And Jesse Marcel continued his career, though he would later express regret about his role in the story, and in the quiet contradiction between what he had seen and what he had been instructed to say. The town of Roswell returned to its normal pace soon enough. Shops reopened, radios played softly in the background, and the wind swept once again over the hills and through the fences. But something had changed beneath the surface. A question had been planted, and even if it was buried, even if it lay dormant for years, it would never truly go away. And so, just as quietly as it began, The Roswell incident was officially over, or at least that's what people were told. In the years that followed the quiet burial of the Roswell incident, life in southeastern New Mexico returned outwardly to the pace it had always known. The days rolled by under the broad, sunlit sky. The cattle continued to graze along dusty fences. Radios played their steady rhythms of news and music, and for a while, the event that had stirred brief headlines and curious questions in July of 1947 seemed to fade gently into the background, like the scent of rain, long after the clouds had moved on. But for a small and growing number of researchers, servicemen, writers, and listeners scattered across the country, the event had not ended at all. It had only gone quiet. And beneath the stillness of official reports and public forgetfulness, there remained a hum, a barely audible note of mystery that refused to go away. Not loud enough to demand attention, but persistent enough to keep being noticed again and again, like a light at the corner of one's vision that flickers without explanation. At first, in the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the idea of flying saucers and otherworldly visitors lived mostly on the fringes of conversation, appearing occasionally in comic books, in pulp novels, or in grainy black and white films that played in theaters on quiet Saturday afternoons. Stories meant for entertainment, for imagination, rarely for belief. Yet, even so, they left their mark, gently, as folklore does, settling slowly into the minds of a generation, still learning how to live under the shadow of atomic power and the long reach of military secrecy. It was during this time the reports of strange lights, fast-moving objects, and unidentified aerial phenomena began to be filed with increasing frequency, not just by civilians, but also by trained pilots, air traffic controllers, and servicemen, many of whom had little interest in being seen as imaginative or fanciful, but who nonetheless found themselves quietly reporting things they could not explain. Things that moved too quickly, too sharply, or hovered without sound in places where nothing should be hovering at all. Still, Roswell remained a footnote, a largely forgotten blip in the vast timeline of post-war America, until the early 1970s, when something shifted, slowly at first, then with more energy. As the mood of the country began to change, trust in government institutions began to falter, first from the revelations of Vietnam, then from the quiet erosion brought by Watergate, and in this climate of growing skepticism and whispered doubt, stories like Roswell began to feel less like science fiction and more like the quiet pieces of a much larger puzzle. It was around this time that Stanton Friedman, a nuclear physicist who had developed a growing interest in unidentified flying objects, began to investigate the Roswell incident directly, sifting through archives, visiting libraries, and most importantly, tracking down the people who had been there. Men like Major Jesse Marcel, who had served as the intelligence officer at the Roswell Army Airfield, and who had been among the first to handle the debris recovered from the ranch. In an interview given in the late 1970s, Marcel stated plainly that the material he had seen and handled was not from a weather balloon, and not from any technology he recognized. He spoke calmly, without excitement, describing the foil-like pieces, the strange beams, the symbols that did not belong to any known language, and the quiet insistence that what was found in that field was far beyond the materials of any balloon or radar reflector known at the time. This quiet confession did not spark immediate fire, but it struck a slow chord, and it led others to come forward. Some who had been present during the recovery, others who had heard fragments of stories passed down through family or military channels. And while the accounts varied in detail and clarity, a shared theme began to emerge: that something had been found, that it had not been ordinary, and that great care had been taken to suppress what was known, not with malice, but with method, not with violence, but with silence. Books began to appear, first a few, then more, each weaving together testimonies, photographs, diagrams, and interviews, forming narratives that attempted to reconstruct what had happened over those few days in July of 1947. Some speculating that a craft had crashed, others that bodies had been recovered, small and humanoid, not wounded, but lifeless. Their arrival unexpected, and their appearance unlike anything native to this world. There were claims of cover-ups, of threats made in quiet voices behind closed doors, of materials shipped off to distant labs, files labeled above top secret. There were maps drawn from memory, sketches made by trembling hands, and statements given decades after the fact by men whose eyes had grown heavy with age, but who still remembered, still felt the weight of what they had seen, even if they rarely spoke of it aloud. In the early 1990s, the story gained new visibility when it was brought to the attention of Congress, prompted by constituents who wanted answers and by journalists who continued to pursue the inconsistencies. And, in response, the United States Air Force released an official report in 1994, acknowledging that the debris recovered on the ranch had indeed come from a classified operation, but not one involving extraterrestrial life. Instead, it was said to be part of Project Mogul, a secret program aimed at detecting Soviet nuclear tests using high-altitude balloon arrays equipped with sensitive sound equipment. The report was technical, filled with diagrams and declassified documents, and it seemed to provide a rational explanation for the strange materials found by Mac Brazel, and for the military's secrecy at the time. Yet, for many, it did little to resolve the deeper questions. The questions not about balloons or sensors, but about why so many people over so many years continue to recall something entirely different. 3 years later, a second Air Force report was released, this time addressing the claims about recovered alien bodies, suggesting that these stories had likely originated from mistaken sightings of anthropomorphic test dummies used in high-altitude parachute experiments during the 1950s. Mannequins that were dropped from planes and retrieved from remote areas, sometimes by locals who had never seen such devices before, their joints and limbs unfamiliar, their faces blank and rubbery, their silence unsettling. This explanation, though thorough and plausible in tone, introduced another contradiction, as it required that witnesses had confused events across different decades, blending memories of 1947 with experiences from the mid-1950s, an overlap that many researchers found difficult to accept, especially given the clarity and consistency of some of the earliest testimonies. And so, even with the reports, even with the files and the diagrams and the technical statements, the mystery did not close. Instead, it settled further into the public consciousness, not as a problem to be solved, but as a riddle to be lived with, the soft uncertainty that invited quiet thought rather than firm answers. Over time, the story of Roswell evolved from a news event into a kind of modern mythology, a symbolic story told not just for what it claimed to be, but for what it represented: the possibility that we are not alone, the suspicion that we are not always told everything, and the enduring comfort of a mystery that does not demand resolution. In Roswell itself, the town gradually embraced the legend. Museums were opened, festivals were planned, merchandise was created, and tourists arrived year after year, not in search of proof, but in search of connection, of participation in a story that had grown larger than the facts and more human than any document. There were murals on walls, silver figures in storefronts, neon signs shaped like saucers, and rooms filled with exhibits that ranged from the earnest to the playful, all quietly orbiting around that same quiet truth that something happened here, something curious, something that will likely never be fully explained. And through it all, the wind kept moving through the trees, the desert nights remained still and filled with stars, and the question at the heart of it all continued to flicker gently, not like a fire, but like a distant light blinking slowly just above the horizon. And perhaps that is where the story truly lives, not in proof or denial, but in the space between, in the comfort of wondering, in the calm of not knowing, in the soothing thought that even after all this time, there may still be something out there, watching, waiting, or simply passing by. And as we listen now, not to newsreels or documentaries, but to the quiet telling of an old story, we allow ourselves to rest beside it, not to solve it, not to explain it, but simply to be near it, to fall asleep with it, gently in the soft hum of the unknown. As the decades continued to stretch beyond that quiet summer of 1947, the story of Roswell did not disappear. Instead, it softened, it settled like dust over desert brush, and rather than closing itself with time, it expanded, slowly, quietly, until it was no longer just a question of what had happened on a single ranch, but a much larger question, one that curled itself into the folds of modern imagination, asking softly whether we were alone, whether truth could be hidden, and whether some answers were meant not to be discovered, but only to be wondered about. The 1990s had brought with them a renewal of interest in UFOs and sightings, in conspiracies, both real and imagined, and in stories that once seemed distant but now returned with a quiet urgency, driven in part by the soft erosion of trust in institutions, and in part by the explosion of accessible media, lined shelves in independent stores. Documentaries were released on late-night cable channels, and suddenly the Roswell Incident was no longer a secret among researchers. It was a cultural reference, a shared curiosity, something you might hear discussed in passing by a neighbor, or mentioned casually in the script of a primetime television show. Roswell was no longer just a place. It had become a symbol, a story that belonged to everyone and no one. And in the mid-1990s, This transformation reached a kind of cultural tipping point when a grainy, flickering black and white film surfaced, claiming to show an alien autopsy performed by military officials in the aftermath of the crash. The footage was strange, slow, almost hypnotic in its quiet movement. It showed figures in surgical gowns leaning over a small form on a table, its body still, its features unfamiliar, its presence unsettling, yet oddly serene. The so-called alien autopsy film became a phenomenon, not because everyone believed it was real, but because it captured the atmosphere of Roswell so perfectly. Not one of violence or fear, but of mystery, of distance, the strange weight that silence can carry when left to sit too long without explanation. The footage was later revealed to be a recreation, not an authentic artifact, but even so, its influence endured. It had given visual form to something previously only imagined, and in doing so, it deepened the space Roswell occupied in the public mind. Television followed closely behind, with shows like The X-Files taking inspiration from Roswell and similar cases, presenting a world where hidden truths lay just beneath the surface of ordinary life, and where soft government denial was always a signal that something larger, something older, something beyond the stars might be present but just out of reach. In this way, the incident transcended history, becoming not just an event, but a genre, not just a moment, but a mood. People began to visit Roswell, not to find truth, but to be close to the place where the not knowing lived. To stand in the quiet streets, to walk through the museum halls filled with models and documents and photographs, to eat at diners with flying saucers painted on the windows, to talk to the locals who had grown up in the long shadow of that singular, uncertain summer, and in doing so, to take part in a collective remembering that was not necessarily about accuracy, but about connection, about feeling the edges of a story that was both small and enormous all at once. Meanwhile, quietly and without much ceremony, military documents continued to be released under the Freedom of Information Act. Declassified reports, handwritten memos, radar logs, and internal briefings from decades past, many of them mundane, technical, filled with acronyms and procedural language, but within them were sometimes small curiosities, lines that hinted at unknown projects, mentions of unidentified objects, acknowledgments that something had been seen, something had been tracked, something had landed or vanished without explanation. These documents did not confirm the more elaborate theories, but they also did not erase them. Instead, they complicated the silence. They made the fog deeper, more textured, and in doing so, they allowed the mystery to endure, not by providing answers, but by feeding the space where answers might one day appear. In more recent years, the story of Roswell has entered yet another chapter, shaped by a world where technology now allows people to share images instantly, to cross-check data, to access flight paths and satellite feeds and high-resolution maps from their phones. And yet, even with all this information, the question remains, and Roswell continues to be referenced in podcasts, in books, in films, and even in hearings held before government panels where military officials and pilots have testified under oath that they have seen objects defying known physics, objects that do not belong to any known inventory of human technology. In 2020, the United States government quietly acknowledged the existence of what it called unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAPs, a more clinical term for UFOs, and in doing so, it opened a door that had been closed for decades, though just a crack. The Pentagon released videos showing fast-moving objects recorded by fighter jet cameras, silent, quick, capable of maneuvering in ways that left even seasoned pilots unable to explain what they had encountered. This disclosure, soft and unsensational in its presentation, brought Roswell back into the conversation, not because it confirmed anything directly, but because it showed that the government now admitted the phenomenon was real, even if its origins remained unknown, even if its nature was still wrapped in ambiguity, even if no conclusions were drawn. And so, nearly 80 years after a rancher named Mac Brazel rode out across the dusty fields of southeastern New Mexico and found strange pieces of foil and sticks and beams lying quietly in the grass, the story continues to unfold, slowly, without urgency, like a soft wind across the desert that stirs nothing loudly, but moves everything, just a little. The town of Roswell remains, not just as a physical place, but as a landscape of thought, a terrain of cultural memory, where people still walk beneath murals of stars in distant galaxies, where school children grow up hearing stories, not of monsters, but of silence, of light, of questions so large they cannot be fully asked. The museums still stand, filled with the gentle hum of exhibits and narrated recordings. The shops still sell tiny gray figurines and novelty t-shirts. The festivals still unfold each year with music, with costumes, with shared laughter, not because anyone claims to know what happened, but because it feels good to be part of something strange and gentle and enduring. Even those who do not believe in extraterrestrial life often feel drawn to Roswell because the town offers something rare, something peaceful. It offers the permission to wonder, to sit with a question and not demand that it be answered, to look up at the sky, not for evidence, but for awe. And in the quiet hours of night, when the roads are still and the wind moves softly across the hills, when the stars blink slowly above the high desert, the story returns again, not with force, not with fear, but with a slow rhythm, like breathing, like memory, like sleep. Because maybe the most lasting legacy of Roswell is not about craft or contact or cover-ups. Maybe it is about comfort, about the timeless human need to find something just beyond the horizon, something just outside the fence, something that makes the night feel less empty. And so the Roswell Incident continues, not as history alone, but as a bedtime story for the modern world, a quiet narrative you can fall asleep beside, a soft, wandering tale that asks only one thing of you: to listen, to let go, and to dream. And now, as we come to the end of this quiet journey through time and sand and sky, you can let everything begin to fade softly. You can feel the edges of the story loosen, like twilight spreading across the desert, slow and weightless, dissolving the last shapes of the day into a calm, cool blue. Because there's nothing more you need to hold on to, and nothing at all that needs solving. You have traveled gently from the streets of Roswell in 1947 to the dry calm of the town's slow mornings, the metallic flicker of mysterious wreckage on a lonely sheep ranch, through the slow unraveling of official stories, and into the long decades of silence, retelling, speculation, and reawakening. And through it all, the mystery never demanded anything of you. It never raised its voice. It never tried to startle or confuse. It only lingered, always waiting, always quiet. And now you are free to let it go, like a cloud passing overhead, slow and harmless, or like sand slipping through open fingers, soft and unresisting, because the story does not need to be finished. It only needs to be felt, and you have felt it fully. Not as an answer to a question, but as a companion to your stillness, to your slow breath, to the soft rhythm of your thoughts, growing dimmer and dimmer with every passing moment. Somewhere far above the earth, the stars continue to turn in silence, not because they have answers, but because they are content to remain where they are, to shine without explanation, to exist without needing to be understood. And you, too, can exist in this moment without needing to reach for clarity, because in this quiet space, you are allowed to let your questions rest, to let your mind uncoil, to let the day fall behind you like the sun behind distant hills. Imagine, if you like, the desert air in the evening, warm at first, then cooling as the light fades, the hum of insects filling the spaces between distant barks of coyotes, and the steady creak of an old wooden gate swinging slowly in the wind. Imagine yourself sitting beneath an open sky, wrapped in a blanket, with nothing ahead of you but the comfort of darkness and the slow glow of the moon above the silent fields. No one is waiting for you to decide anything. No one is asking for conclusions or certainty. Not here, not now, not in the hush that follows a story that never really ended and never needed to, because its beauty was not in its resolution, but in its presence, in the quiet weight it carried, in the way it offered itself to you with no demands, just soft possibility, just a whisper that something happened, and that, perhaps, we will never know exactly what. And yet, even without knowing, we still listened, and that listening was enough. The act of sitting with the unknown was enough. The way you listened, calmly, patiently, perhaps with one eye closed and the other watching the shadows shift along your ceiling, or perhaps with both eyes shut, drifting already between thought and sleep, between now and not now, between remembering and dreaming. The voice that has carried you here will begin to recede, as all voices must, because the story has said what it needed to say. Not loudly, not even clearly, but with care, with softness, with the kind of silence that lingers longer than any sound, a silence you are welcome to keep with you as you rest. And so now you can let go of Roswell, of the ranch, of the base, of the files and the photos and the diagrams and the interviews. Let them all fade, slowly and gently, as if being pulled backward by time itself, turning to their shelves, to their dusty folders, to the high desert wind that carries secrets just beyond the line of sight. Let your body become heavy now, if it hasn't already. Let your hands be still, your shoulders soften, your breath slow and even, like the breeze that slips between distant fence posts, like the air inside an empty church, like the quiet that comes after someone finishes speaking and no one needs to reply. Let the mystery close its eyes now too, not forever, just for the night, and if it dreams, let it dream of stars and static and distant shapes moving through the dark. Let it drift like you, softly and without direction, into the space between what we know and what we can only feel. And if you are still awake, that is fine, because there is no right moment to fall asleep. It will come when it is ready. And until then, you can rest inside the stillness this story has made for you. Stillness shaped like a question that never demands an answer. And if you are already asleep, then that too is fine, because the story has done its work. It has kept you company, and now it lets you go. And if you are just beginning to drift, barely holding on to the last few words as they soften and stretch, then let them carry you. Let them become less and less clear, more and more quiet, until they are only the suggestion of sound, the shadow of thought, the fading breath of something once spoken. Because this is not the kind of story that ends. Not really. This is the kind that finds you when you're tired, sits beside you without a word, and stays just long enough for your mind to let go of the world outside. Roswell will still be there, unchanged, waiting in the background of time, waiting in the mind of the world, waiting in the corners of memory and silence and wonder, and you can return to it anytime. Whenever you want to listen again, whenever you want to fall asleep beside something soft and strange and unfinished. But for now, it is time to rest, to let the story settle like dust on an empty path, to let the voice quiet itself, to let the sky stretch wide above your dreams. There is nothing more to hear, and nothing left to hold. You are safe, you are still, and you are home. The story is over now. Sleep well. Good night.